Hello and welcome to Unstress. I'm Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Now, if you've been listening over the last year, or if you've been reading carefully the literature, it seems that almost every chronic degenerative disease, that's heart attack, cancer, over 80 autoimmune diseases, type 2 diabetes, and of course obesity, is all affected by insulin and blood sugar levels. The higher the insulin, the higher the blood sugar, the worse it is for your health. And if you have a diagnosis of any of those, the chance of you overcoming them is significantly reduced. So what is insulin and why is it a problem? Why is it so important when it's too high, which is most common, and even when it's too low? What about low carb, healthy fat diet? What do we mean? What about ketogenic diet? What does that actually look like? Over the last few years, this idea of time-restricted eating, intermittent fasting, or even longer fasts that might go for a day or a few days have also become very popular. Well, my guest today is the co-founder and director of the Intensive Dietary Management, or IDF, program, Megan Ramos. Her co-founder is world-renowned expert on fasting and ketogenic diets and best-selling author Dr. Jason Fung. Jason has written some best-selling books, including The Obesity Code and The Diabetes Code. He has some great YouTube talks, which I'd really encourage you to explore and have a look at. Megan's role in the IDM program is to facilitate the patient's education on the IDM dietary principles and counsel them on their fasting regimes. Megan works with patients both in the office and in their online long-distance program. She travels the world educating both the public and health practitioners on this approach. I hope you enjoyed this conversation I had with Megan Ramos. Welcome to the show, Megan.
Hi, Ron. Thanks for having me on today.
Tell us a bit about the program itself. What does the IDM program entail?
Absolutely. So we're a time-restricted eating and therapeutic fasting program. So we work with patients on when they eat. We will also help people with what they eat if they're interested. We try not to pigeonhole anybody into any one diet, but we do have a recommended diet, and it is a low carbohydrate diet that we do recommend to our people if they are asking for a specific diet. But we try to find the right fasting regimen to help treat conditions associated with insulin, high levels of insulin. So all metabolic conditions like from diabetes to fatty liver to PCOS to obesity. And now we're working with other conditions, cancer, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy. So conditions that are largely a result of sort of inflammation. So we've work with, from just eliminating stacking and constructing low carbohydrate meals to, people keeping up with sort of whatever diet they're comfortable with, but perhaps doing some more fasting. And we really believe that when you eat is just as powerful, if not more powerful, than when you eat. We get pretty great results with our patients across the board, regardless of their diet. But we do get the best results with patients on low carb. So that's why that's our main recommended diet. We started out, we rent a room in a nephrology clinic and here in Toronto, in a borough of Toronto called Scarborough. And we were seeing patients there, and around the same time that IDM started to take off, we were getting emails from Americans, primarily Americans, and just begging for education. They said, we get it. You're in Canada. You might not be able to adjust our medications. We can't come see you in person. You can't order our lab work. We understand that, but we just want education from you and advice on what to do. And around the same time, I started dating my husband, who is American. And shortly after we started dating, his mom became very sick. And I had my first real experience with the American healthcare system and never realized how fortunate I was to be Canadian at that point. And so I started engaging with some of these people from the US who were emailing me and finding out how much they were spending on insulin a month. And some of them so much so that they were living out of their cars in order to afford their medication. And I'm listening to my mother-in-law have like a mandatory, like life-saving procedure and being so happy she only owed $8,000 afterwards. And as a Canadian, I just couldn't fathom that. So I talked to Jason. I was just so, desperate. I'm like, how do we help these people? We have to help these people. So I started doing online counseling, educating, with people primarily from the US. And as people around the globe got to know about fasting more and IDM and Toronto and Jason Fung and Megan Ramos, as we had podcasts and stuff become available and we're doing various interviews. It sort of branched off from not just the US, but we have a lot of clients from the UK, throughout Europe, the Middle East, Australia, New Zealand, Mexico.
Fantastic.
So it's been really amazing. So Jason and I still have this small little experimental clinic in Toronto. I do like the clinic stuff, but actually most of the people we see now are online. So we work with them. It's video conferencing, and we do small group counseling. And we have an educator. I might not be myself right now. I'm working on educating other healthcare professionals. But I trained a team of people who I oversee, and they're working to help share all the knowledge that Jason and I have learned over the last several years and help guide people towards success. And we also, you have to roll with the times too. 5 years ago, no one was familiar with fasting. They're like, what are you talking about? That's crazy. And nowadays it's just hilarious because I'll be walking down a street in Toronto and there'll be two people behind me, not even realizing that they're behind me of all people. And they're just healthy young people striking up a conversation about how they just did a 24-hour fast and how great they felt. And it's just so amazing. So we also have sort of an online monthly membership program where people can just get some support and continuing education on fasting, just to sort of help them sort of troubleshoot any issues that they have. So we're trying to evolve with the times here at IDM. It's been really cool to see such a global transformation in how people receive intermittent fasting. Doctors and people all over the world used to be completely outraged at us half a decade ago, and now it's just crazy to see it like on regular news channels in North America.
Now, I mean, that's fantastic, and we're obviously going to have links to all this, but interestingly, over the last year, we have done many interviews about cancer, about women's health, PCOS, endometriosis. We've done things on heart health, on MS, on gut health, and the common denominator lesson that I've learned is the more under control the insulin is, the better we are in general. So,
yes.
And I wanted to talk about this intermittent fasting and all that, but I wanted to do a couple of basics here. It's an opportunity for us, for our regular listeners. This will just be revision, but for somebody hearing this for the first time, it's good to have it all in one place. Let's start with insulin 101. Well, what does insulin do? When does it become a problem?
So insulin is a very important hormone in the body. It has many functions, and the most important, perhaps one of the most important, and the one that people commonly know about, is that it helps your body metabolize glucose. So insulin's a hormone that's secreted by the pancreas, and is often secreted in volume based on the amount of glucose you consume in volume, so from carbohydrates. And its job is to help, guide the glucose to the cell and open up the cell to let the glucose go in. But like everything in life, too little or too much of it is problematic. We know that type 1 diabetics, they have type 1 diabetes because their pancreas fails to produce insulin or sufficient insulin in order for this glucose metabolism to occur. So if you think of insulin as a key that unlocks the cell to let the glucose in type 1 diabetics, they don't produce enough keys. So that's problematic. So too little insulin is very dangerous and life-threatening because you don't get those keys to let the glucose into the cells. But in type 2 diabetes, too much insulin is the product of or results in type 2 diabetes. So too much of anything that's good for us is a horrendous situation for the body. Everything that's good for us is bad for us in excess. And I think that's one thing as a species we just lack common sense of. I'm seeing it now a lot with fasting. Well, if one day of fasting is good for us, 120 days of fasting must be better for us. And that's not the case. But it's the same thing. Insulin's vital for our survival. Without enough of it, we run into a scary situation, a potentially life-threatening situation of type 1 diabetes that needs insulin therapy for. But too much of it can cause a whole variety of diseases. And insulin, it's very inflammatory in the body, and it also causes a lot of growth. Insulin causes growth. And in adulthood, growth isn't always desired. It's almost always a negative situation when you have growth. So think of cancer, for example, or the growth of polycystic cysts on ovaries and the development of polycystic ovarian syndrome. Growth is usually bad in adults. During these times, you don't want to have growth. So when you're producing a lot of this insulin as a result of your diet, because insulin is produced sort of in response or in response to the amount of carbohydrates you consume, a couple of things go on. You have the ability for this unwanted growth and the inflammation that comes along with that. And your body actually builds up sort of a resistance to this insulin. So this is how type 2 diabetes develops. Your cells become resistant to the insulin because it's just bombarded with insulin all day long. The cells themselves, they become really sort of saturated with fat on the inside. They can't really squeeze any more in there. And then once they get so full, they just totally develop this resistance towards your own insulin. I always joke, I love the singer Adele. And several years ago, she had an album come out around the same time I was going through a serious breakup as a young woman. And she writes all these heartbreaking songs. And so I loved her music. She was like my therapist and my best friend getting through my breakup. But then she, her album was a hit, and she moved on in her life like I did. And then a few years ago, she had a new album come out, and I was all excited because, she was one of my favorite music artists, and she had that song come out, Hello. And I think that song won about 15 Grammys that year. It was a very popular song. And at first I loved it. A great singer. She's a wonderful vocalist. And I had such a connection to her because of my past experience with her. But then everybody loved it. So it became overplayed. And one day I was driving home and the song Hello was playing on 8 of my 12 preset channels in my car. And I just wanted to scream goodbye to Adele. And I had developed Adele resistance.
Okay. I wondered where we were going with there, but I could see the insulin. No, that's good. Good analogy. So you had Adele resistance syndrome.
Yes. And it's the same thing with insulin in response to the diet and the cells. They develop this resistance towards the cells.
Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah, but it's so we've got inflammation, we've got too little, too much. It's also about storage too, isn't it? I mean, it's got a lot to do with our fat or obesity, I guess.
Yes. When the fat cells just get too full. That's sort of when they start to develop the resistance towards insulin.
Yeah.
Insulin's a hormone that will convert all this excess sugar in our diet to fat.
Yeah. So that's great. That gives us a great understanding of insulin 101. Now, here's another term I want to throw at you because people hear it a lot and it means different things to different people. Low carb. How do we define low carb?
Low carb, I mean, there are people that do low carb to all different degrees. With low carbohydrate diets, we really encourage our patients to really cut out refined and processed carbohydrates out of their diet completely. If they're going to consume carbohydrates, really encourage them to consume non-starchy and fibrous carbohydrates and sort of focus on more natural foods too, foods that come from the earth. So essentially the outside of the supermarket, nothing in a box or a bag, tube, and rarely from a can. So we encourage our patients to eat lots of food that is fibrous and non-starchy. The biggest thing with the low carbohydrate diet is you want to consume foods that are going to limit the amount of insulin that's produced by the body. And that's what sort of leads to a successful low carbohydrate diet. And if people already have a lot of insulin in their body, a lot of insulin toxicity in their body causing disease, then you really want to limit the amount of insulin that you're adding into the body versus if you're a healthier individual that doesn't have toxic levels of insulin in the body. So depending on where you're starting from, you do have a little bit more room to consume more or less carbohydrates. But the bottom line is whether you're healthy or not, you want to avoid consuming foods that really raise the insulin levels. So carbohydrates, ones that are easily and rapidly digested, cause larger blood sugar spikes, which result in larger insulin spikes. So we encourage our patients to eat a lot of vegetables that grow above the ground because they're very high in fiber. They're very slow to digest. They're not completely digested, and they don't really result in any of those insulin surges or insulin spikes, very little insulin production at all. We encourage our patients too to eat a lot of healthy fat because fat actually causes very little insulin to be produced, almost minimal. So we want to make sure that we have enough insulin in our body, but not too much of it. So that's the whole goal of the low carbohydrate diet, is to eat foods that don't cause your body to produce too much insulin.
And a lot of people that go on that also feel that artificial sweeteners are a good alternative to that low carb option, but that's not quite as simple as that either, is it?
No, it's not. There is evidence out there to suggest that despite not always having a glucose response, that a lot of these sweeteners do have an insulin response. Stevia, for example, has an insulin response. And several years when we started IDM, there was less information out there to sort of support this. And my attitude at the time with patients, I've worked with over 8,000 patients personally in the last 7 years doing this. My attitude several years ago was that, okay, it's much better you take the stevia than the crappy table sugar. So take the stevia instead. But all of these patients who took it, they struggled for a couple of reasons. One of them was just that the taste of something sweet made them crave a bunch of sweet things, which is another chain of events. But a lot of them still struggled with high blood sugar levels. We couldn't get their A1C down. We couldn't get them to lose weight. They were really struggling with fasting because they were hungry all of the time. And those are all things to let me know that their insulin levels just weren't improving. And as we would periodically take their fasting insulin, it wasn't changing like the patients who weren't consuming stevia. Mm-hmm. So we would ask them all to cut it out, and then instantly, within 2 weeks, they all had great improvements across the board.
Yeah. Now, fasting is this new and exciting thing. We were just talking about this before we started, and I've been interested in nutrition for so many years. 30 or 40 years. And, fasting makes so much sense. We talk about ancestral past, but tell us about the different types of fast. What's the difference between time-restricted eating, intermittent fasting, and, what are the different forms of this, utilizing this fasting approach?
Absolutely. So the most basic one that we work with patients, we just call it time restricted eating, is that, in a day, they're not doing any great fasting. But we live in a society where we're preached at to eat 6 or 7 times throughout the day. We're told to snack. And regardless, even if that isn't our intention, we're very busy. So to sit down and have a proper meal, those are things of the past. They're not necessarily things that are easily achievable in this modern age, because life is more hectic now than ever has been. So people just don't eat meals anymore. So with time restricted eating, we try to get back to the basics where people are eating meals, having their breakfast, having their lunch, having their dinner, not snacking before dinner, like all of those old shows on television, and how my grandmother say to me, I wouldn't let your father eat before dinner. He had to save his appetite for his dinner. And, if you don't eat to satiation at dinner, well, then, you're going to have to starve for the rest of the evening, that old school mentality. So we really try to get back to basics where patients are just eating their proper meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right, and not snacking, and trying to eat their dinner at a more reasonable hour, trying to make that a priority. So there is a little bit of a fast from dinner one night until breakfast the following day. So that's what we call time restricted eating, where you're just eating meals. And so you're just having these little bumps in insulin about 2 or 3 times a day, depending on whether you're eating 2 or 3 meals a day. With intermittent fasting, we have our patients intermittent fasts, meaning they do a day of fasting and a day of no fasting. So it's intermittent. So Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, they may fast. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturdays, and Sundays, they would not fast. Still on the non-fasting days, we encourage time-restricted eating. Don't snack, consume your meals, but fast between meals. Now, for intermittent fasting regimens, we usually recommend a 24 or 36-hour fast. We find that they work very well for weight loss and diabetes reversal. So a 24-hour fast would be fasting from dinner on Sunday night to dinner on Monday night. So you're missing breakfast and lunch on Monday. So you essentially miss 2 consecutive meals. Mm-hmm. Or a 36-hour fast would be fasting from dinner on Sunday until breakfast on Tuesday. So you're just not eating all day Monday. So we found the best success with our metabolic patients is doing that 3 times a week, since it does take people a while to sort of cut out the carbs and eat a more lower insulin producing diet. So 3 times a week seems to work well. So intermittent means is there's variation. A period of fasting followed by a period of feasting, and a period of fasting and a period of feasting. With extended fast, these are where people go a few days, 3 to several days of just straight fasting, where they're just sort of consuming water for the most part, occasionally tea and coffee and broth, depending on their goals with fasting. And they'll do that for about 3 to 7 days, sort of at a time. In our program, we usually cap people at 7 or 14 days, depending on whether we're working with them online or in clinic. Mm-hmm. And we'll do that sort of periodically. And we do the longer fasts more so for disease prevention, and just to really shake things up periodically when someone who appears to have very stubborn insulin resistance or a very low metabolic rate, we'll try to do an extended fast, somewhere from 3 to 7 days, just to shake things up, to really force the insulin levels to go very low during the fast. And we find that usually breakthroughs any plateaus that our patients experience.
And what about 16:8? You know, does that fit under the time restricted eating?
That would be more of a time restricted eating where you're just consuming 2 meals a day.
Yeah.
Most often people elect to skip breakfast and they consume lunch and dinner. I actually do the opposite. I eat breakfast, but I eat it 4 hours after I wake up. And then I eat lunch, and then I don't eat in the evening time, but that works better for my schedule. So people can do either or, but for our patients, a 16:8, where you're just having those 2 consecutive meals and missing either breakfast or dinner, that we actually consider to be an eating day. And that's what we encourage a lot of our patients to try to achieve for their eating days. So that would be time restricted eating in our program.
And how do we prepare for fasting? Like, if we've accepted that this is something I really need to explore because our blood chemistries are all stuck and our weight is stuck no matter what. Okay, I'm going to go down this path of fasting. How do we prepare for it? What are some of the challenges?
So there's a couple. If you're coming off of sort of a very high carb diet, you're going to be having, your body's going to be pretty saturated with insulin because you're eating carbs all of the time. So if you immediately jump into a fast, your insulin levels are going to drop quite rapidly. When your insulin levels fall very rapidly, a message is sent to your kidneys saying, release water, release water. So you'll urinate out a lot. And often, if you're coming off of a high carb meal, you might experience diarrhea as a result of your body just trying to find ways to eliminate that water. People often find that they become dehydrated as a result. Their electrolytes get pretty depleted. So in terms of preparing for a fast, there's a few approaches that we take with patients. And one of them is starting a low carb or a ketogenic diet prior to them starting a fast. This way, their insulin levels drop as the person can regularly sort of eating meals. So they're able to replenish water and electrolytes a little bit more effectively. And then that way, when they jump into a fast, their insulin levels aren't going to drop as dramatically right off the bat. And we prevent that dehydration and feeling unwell from the low electrolytes. Sometimes, patients will prefer to adopt the low carb diet, or an extremely low carb version of the low carb diet is called a ketogenic diet, where people consume very minimal carbohydrates, if any. And we'll ask them to do that for about 3 or 4 days leading up to their very first fast. And we find that prevents a lot of issues with the electrolytes. Alternatively, if someone is just more hesitant about fasting and they're already following a relatively good diet, a moderate low carb diet or ketogenic diet, we would just cut out snacking. We would ask them to sort of move their evening meal up. And then when they're feeling comfortable with that and we're able to retrain themselves to actually sit down and take the time to have 3 proper meals a day, and then to start cutting out breakfast and then lunch or dinner, depending on what's easier for them. And then each week, just trying to sort of scale out one meal until they're able to start fasting.
Now, one of the definitions that I was going to ask you about, and you've just raised it, is the ketogenic diet. And just again, remind our listener about what the principle behind that and what we're trying to achieve with the ketogenic diet.
Absolutely. So with a ketogenic diet, you're definitely not producing very much insulin because you're keeping the carbs extremely low. And what's sort of different between a low carb diet versus a ketogenic diet is, on a low carb diet, your body is still fueling on carbohydrates. It's also fueling on some fat, but it's still fueling on some carbohydrates. But when you're on a ketogenic diet, you switch fuel sources almost entirely from glucose, from sugar fuel, to fat fuel. And the fat fuel is a substance called ketones. So that's hence the term the ketogenic diet. So you go from glucose fueling, sugar fueling, to ketone fueling or fat fueling. So when you're in a state of ketosis, your body's actually fueling off fats. Most of your organs are fueling off of fat, and tissues are fueling off of fat. And it's quite a beneficial state. It's very anti-inflammatory to fuel on ketones versus fuel on glucose. It's a very, I joke with patients, I say it's like a very high octane fuel for your body. And you want to, think of your body as a Ferrari, not, a 30-year-old discount car. You want to fuel off the best high octane that you can. So ketones are a very good fuel source for your body. Major organs like your heart and your kidney actually prefer to fuel off of ketones than glucose. They function very efficiently on them. So when you're in a state of ketosis, you're primarily fat fueling rather than sugar fueling. So that's the slight difference between the keto diet and a low carbohydrate diet.
And of course, if by any chance an individual happened to have some spare fat lying around their body, which according to the statistics 60% or something of us do, then you'd be burning that as well.
Yes, absolutely. So it's important. A very effective way to burn fat, especially if you're fasting.
Yeah. And again, that relates back to the insulin level, which is what we started part of our conversation about.
Yes. If you're consuming a ketogenic diet, it's a primarily fat-based diet. And when you eat fat, your body really is not producing any insulin in response to the fat that you're consuming. It's very minimal anyways, especially compared to carbohydrates. In order for your body to fuel off of sugar, it needs insulin. But in order for your body to fuel off of fat or off of ketones, it doesn't need insulin for that to happen. So you're really minimizing any excess insulin production by the body from your diet.
And you mentioned the preparation for fasting and the carbohydrate go on to a low carb diet because of this losing of water and everything. But keto flu is another thing that people experience. Can you just tell our listener what keto flu is and its surprising fix for it? I thought this was interesting.
Keto flu. So you literally feel like you have the flu. A dizziness, headache, feel weak, feel a little bit nauseous. And it's usually sort of this is your body sort of transitioning from a state of fat fueling or carb fueling, sugar fueling, to a state of fat fueling. So, it's, if you think of it, you've had the sugar burning factory running in your body for a very long time. And the fat burning factory has been sitting there dormant, maybe for your whole life. And now you're trying to get that up and running and at full speed. There's going to be kinks. It's the opening of the fat burning factory isn't going to be very easily. So one of the biggest issues now is as you transition from the sugar burning diet to the fat burning diet, you're no longer requiring insulin, to be produced in such large quantities because you're eliminating the sugar, reducing it drastically, and consuming the fat, which doesn't cause the insulin levels to go up. And so as you start burning body fat, your insulin levels are going to start to drop. Your internal insulin levels are going to start to go down. And again, this signals to the kidneys to let go of water. So during sort of the keto flu, you're transitioning from the sugar burning mode into this fat burning mode. You're getting this drop in insulin levels, and you're getting the release of water, which can, make you a little bit dehydrated and not feel so well. So that's a contributing factor. But also your organs too have to transition from fueling off of glucose to fueling on ketones. And that takes a little while to adapt. And it also sort of leads to the response of the body excreting more sodium in the urine too, which makes you feel a little bit more dehydrated. So the easiest solution for it is to really increase your water and salt intake. That's what we do with patients, for our patients who are new to the program and we know they're coming off of horrendous diets. My diet used to be horrendous despite it following the Canadian food guide. So I'm not saying that everyone's out there eating fast food all the time, but lots of grains, starches, lots of fruits. The only thing we really recommend is for our patients to be diligent about their water and salt intake. Most people don't drink very much throughout the day because they're eating constantly throughout the day, and a lot of food has water in it. So people forget that they need to drink throughout the day because it's a habit that we don't really have, because we have the habit of eating to get our water intake rather than getting a glass of water and just drinking to get our hydration in. So we encourage our patients to be very mindful, try to consume at least 2 liters of water a day, and to take salt throughout the day, or to take chicken stock, chicken bone broth or beef bone broth, just to help them get through the fast. Something else that helps too is increasing your fat intake. Can also help speed up the side effects of transitioning from a sugar burner into a fat burner, and that can reduce your symptoms as well.
Tell me, when you're on a fast, so back onto the fasting, what are you? Is it water? Just water? Is coffee? Is coffee? Am I right or wrong? And does coffee stimulate insulin as well? I remember hearing that at one point, but I may be wrong. What should we be doing when we're fasting?
Yes, absolutely. So most of our patients who are fasting to treat their metabolic syndrome, we permit them to have water, tea, coffee, and broth when they're fasting. We ask them to consume minimal broth. It's usually something that we only ask them to consume at the start if they're brand new to fasting, just to help prevent against the symptoms of the keto flu. But once they've been fasting for a couple of months, we ask them to cut out the broth when they're on a fasting day. Tea usually is quite benign in patients, so we'll encourage our patients to have herbal teas if they wish to do so during a fast. Coffee is problematic for some people. We definitely know in certain individuals it has an insulin response. And we'll have people say, I drank a cup of black coffee and it raised my blood sugar, several points. And I felt hungry afterwards, pretty ravenous. And the caffeine in coffee, it causes your body to release cortisol. And cortisol is a stress hormone. And cortisol causes your body to release extra insulin. So we see this hormonal response being much greater and more significant in some people than others. So we always caution our patients, if they are drinking a few cups of coffee a day when they're fasting and they're not seeing their blood sugar levels start to come down, if they're really struggling with their fast because they're feeling hungry, then to try to cut it back to 1 or no coffees throughout the day. When we're treating a patient with a neurological condition or cancer, for those patients, we just stick to water just to play it extra safe. So those patients will consume water and some salt if they absolutely must before or during the fast.
Mm-hmm. And when you come off a diet, a fast, be it 1, 2, 3, whatever number of days, well, what would be the preferred way of doing that?
So for longer fasts, the biggest issue is your body only has so much energy every day, or I guess energy dollars every day, and if you're spending money on producing digestive enzymes that you don't need because you're not eating, well, after a few days, your body's going to say, well, hey, you're not eating, so I'm going to take this daily energy budget and I'm going to direct it elsewhere. And I'm going to stop paying to have these digestive juices being produced. So sometimes when you start eating something, you eat it and then your body says, oh no, Megan's eating again. Damn it. We've got to produce these digestive juices. But sometimes it takes a while and everything can go through you or back up. So people can occasionally experience some nausea or some diarrhea. And then, of course, GI distress when their body's trying to figure out what it's going to do with this food. Usually, the most problematic food items are eggs and are nuts. They're both relatively difficult to digest on the body once you're leaving a fasted state. So we usually encourage people to forget eggs and to forget nuts for the first meal after a fast. And actually, it's the one meal that we ever encourage people to just take a step back with the fat and to focus on more non-starchy fiber and a little bit leaner protein for that meal, because those are typically the fiber sort of sits in the tummy for a while, stretches it out. It doesn't cause as much distress. Animal fats are also very problematic and seem to lead to a lot of GI distress because they're typically a little bit more, animal fat and protein are a little bit more difficult for a person to digest post-fast. So we just sort of stick to more leaner proteins, more non-starchy vegetables, and limit the fat, especially the animal fats, and eggs and nuts when breaking a fast.
And tell me, how does this differ with age? I mean, when kids, what would you say about fasting in kids?
Well, kids, you want growth, right? So if you're fasting, you're fasting in adults to prevent growth or to help eradicate growth by suffocating the insulin and really dragging the insulin levels down. Now, in children, you want them to grow, but does that mean that they need to eat all day long? Absolutely not. I'm 34. I'm going to start a family in the next couple of years. My colleague, Jason Fung, he's got 2 kids, and they're around the age 15 and 12. And he said, they don't need to be eating from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed. So when we do have people that ask us about children, you said breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you want them to grow, but you want them to have these little pulses of insulin being produced throughout the day. You don't want to have a steady stream of insulin being produced for the entire, 14 or 16 hours that they're awake every day. So, his kids, he said, they would wake up and eat. They go to school and they'd immediately give them a snack. They'd have recess and have a snack. And it just never ended. They would, in the evening, they'd play soccer and take 2 breaks for snacks. And then they would have a snack before bed. And both of them had a little bit of a weight issue. So they cut out the snacking in their house and they really focus on having proper meals. And his kids they've got great muscle mass. To look at both of them now, there's no excess body fat on them. They're nice, strong, healthy, well-focused, energetic children. So, with kids, we sort of encourage, eat dinner and then fast until breakfast the next day. So they're getting in somewhere between 12 to 14 hours, but really just trying to eliminate the snacking and just to maintain, a healthy childhood, not growing up like me, eating 12 times a day and developing fatty liver at the age of 12.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because type 2 diabetes used to be referred to as late onset diabetes, and we've kind of dropped that term now because kids are getting type 2 diabetes.
Oh, it's absolutely wild. I said to Jason one day in clinic a year or so ago, I said, I don't know if I'm just getting older and the patients are seeming younger, or if they're just really younger. So we had some summer students and I asked them to do an analysis, and the average age of people coming into the program every year is dropping dramatically. Wow. And I just can't believe the number of people under the age of 25 that I see that have type 2 diabetes is just so mind blowing. I said when I was first diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and I said to my family doctor, she said, well, Megan, it's your family history. And I said, well, how come my grandmother was able to make it to 75? And how come my father was able to make it to 55? Why the heck am I getting this at 27? What was my grandmother doing so different? What's so special about her diabetic genes that are different from my diabetic genes. That gave her an extra 50 years on me before developing diabetes. Like, yes, sure, there's a genetic component there, of predisposition, but what changed? And if you look back at it, my grandmother for most of her life till her midlife, ate very well. Ate real butter, didn't snack around meals, ate 3 meals a day, didn't eat late at night, while watching TV. And my father didn't start doing that until his 30s. And I was born doing that. That's how I was raised. And, sort of 30 years after each of us transitioned our diet, we all developed diabetes. Roughly 25 to 30 years after the McGovern report in 77, my grandmother changed her diet towards low fat, high carb, started eating more often because she was more hungry. And, within 30 years, she had developed type 2 diabetes. Same with my father, and I just always grew up eating that way because I was born in 84 and then had this extra paranoia because of my family history. So I very much stayed away from fat and ate a lot of processed food as a result, that I thought was good for me. So it is about the diet. It plays a big role, this diet.
Now, if someone was listening to this for the first time, and if they're a regular listener to this podcast, they haven't, but let's imagine they have, and they wanted to implement these changes and they wanted to get into the fasting, etc., what would be a few tips that you might give them to get them going? What would be a couple of tips?
Yeah, I would just go at it slowly, because most of us, doing too much of anything again can be bad for us, or too much of a shock to our system. So just go at it slowly. Start cutting out snacks. Try not to eat late at night, especially, and then slowly start cutting out one meal at a time. And let it happen a little bit more naturally. Don't try to force your body into doing several days of fasting if you've never done any fast before. So cutting out snacks is extremely, extremely powerful. So that's where I'd usually recommend people start. And then also back to the hydration, people just typically don't drink water, especially if you're coming off of drinking lots of sodas and juice. People tend to not drink water. So we always recommend to our patients that are new that they drink 2 cups of water for every cup of tea or coffee that they drink throughout a day, just to help train people to drink water. And so give them this little mini goal. Okay, I can have 2 cups of water before I have my next cup of tea. And this will just really help keep you hydrated and prevent against the keto flu.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now, listen, this has been fantastic. We're coming to the end of it all. I just wanted to ask you one last question, that is taking a step back from your role here at IDM. And, considering we're all on this health journey in our lives, what do you think the biggest challenge is for people on that health journey through life in our modern world?
Well, I mean, carbohydrates, I have people with this sort of real serious food addiction. It's tough. And I myself, I'll be the first one to say it. I didn't go into a gas station for 1 year. I didn't go into a coffee shop for 1 year. If I couldn't pay for my gas at the pump, I would go to a different gas station. If the coffee shop didn't have a drive-through, I wouldn't go to it. We're just sort of bombarded by these carbohydrates, is highly processed and refined food that they engineer to be very tasty and addictive, that when we consume cause the whole hormonal cascade that, makes us crave them and want them even more and makes us sick. And I think one of the things that people struggle with the most is just that society. No one, everywhere you go, is bombarded with carbohydrates. A friend of mine, Ken Berry, posted a picture on Twitter the other day, and I think he was he was in a pharmacy checkout, and at the pharmacy checkout, it was just all like this big rack of candy. And he's like, of course, you take the candy so you can get more sick, so you come back to the pharmacy and buy more more medication. It's just ludicrous. And this is how the government tells us to eat these carbohydrates. It's how friends and family. My mother still to this day, despite all my success and everything I do with patients and the results that we get, she still doesn't believe that the Canadian government, isn't looking at what I'm doing and thinking, okay, if this is what's really best for people, then we've got to promote this. She, it's hard for her to understand that, there's different lobbying groups involved, what actually goes into making our food guidelines. It's tough. So people genuinely believe the governments have our best interests in mind, that money doesn't matter, that they want our best health. So there's, they're making their food guidelines based on actual science and good science at that, which we know that they're not. So you have people who chronically don't understand. I feel bad for my husband. I went low carb a few years before I met him. So I was able to stand firm, with my mother. But every holiday she buys my husband like 3 pies. Because she knows that one of his biggest vices was pie, and she'll say, "Oh, but it's Canada Day, or it's Labor Day, or it's Thanksgiving. Like you can just have a slice of pie." And so we get all of this pressure from the people who love us to eat these foods. A patient of mine the other week was telling me that his father-in-law passed away, and his wife was going through a bad time, and she sought out comfort in chocolate cake. And asked him to join her for chocolate cake. And he said no, he didn't want any chocolate cake, but he would come sit with her. And she yelled at him and said, "You must not love me if you're not going to eat this chocolate cake with me right now." So it's tough. We're in a society where I think on a subconscious level, everybody's got to know this sugar is bad for us. But yet the government keeps saying that it's okay, and we're just bombarded with it everywhere. That makes it very difficult, I think. And that's the biggest struggle. A patient of mine will have a bad day, go to get gas, and then, be waiting in line to pay for their gas at the station. And then they're just bombarded by all these foods that they know taste good. They're engineered to taste good, and that they consume them all to excess in the past. It's tough. We often, liken it to, we're like drug addicts, but we're living in like a crack house, everywhere we go. It's very tough for people.
Megan, thank you so much for joining us today. We've covered some great territory there. We're going to, of course, have links to the IDM site, and it's terrific what you and Jason have been putting together. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ron, and thank you to everyone listening today.
Well, I've often said if you follow the standard dietary advice, be it the food pyramid or the My Plate or the healthy eating guidelines, be it in Canada, the USA or Australia, I believe you are buying into an economic model that is literally fed by the chemical and processed food industries, with lots of industry-sponsored, peer-reviewed, evidence-based medicine to support it. It's then managed by the pharmaceutical industry, which also sponsors many world experts, providing, and I quote, an evidence-based approach. I believe the term is overused or abused, and it's sometimes very difficult for busy health practitioners who genuinely want the best for their patients to tell the difference between evidence-based medicine and evidence-based marketing. And if the evidence is anything to go by, and if we accept we are what we eat, then the epidemic of preventable chronic degenerative diseases, well, then I think we need to rethink how, when, and what we eat. Interestingly, Megan mentioned that the when we eat may be as important as what. I actually think she said more important. We have become very preoccupied in the last 10 or 15 years with ancestral diets or paleo diets. what did we eat throughout human history? Now, I did my first nutrition course in 1981, so I've been interested in this subject for many years, but one important point has almost always been overlooked. Throughout human history, we evolved to deal with hunger and scarcity. There has never been a time in human history when we have been exposed to the overabundance of seemingly cheap food. And I say seemingly because when you factor in the cost of your own health and the health of the planet, well, it comes at quite an expense. And we're not just exposed to it, it is aggressively and seductively marketed to us. You know, if you go onto the Australian Diabetes Council website, and I've done this a few years ago when they were celebrating their 75th anniversary, and they provided a 10-step program for living life with diabetes. Step 1, eat carbohydrates with every meal and choose low-fat options. Perhaps the key word there, and in case you missed it, was living with diabetes. Follow that advice and you surely will live life with diabetes. Remember, over 80% of diabetes is type 2 diabetes, which is entirely preventable through diet and exercise. Also remember, if you're exploring fasting, approach this slowly and prepare. Transitioning from the healthy eating guidelines type diet to fasting is not the way to go. If you have a medical condition, an underactive or overactive thyroid, consult with an integrative medical practitioner, a naturopath, nutritionist or dietitian who is familiar with the issues to guide you on your way. I'm exploring this myself and I've found it works really well. It's certainly cheap. It could not be cheaper, and it turns into millions of years, and it taps into millions of years of human history. I mean, this is the way we've evolved. Now, we'll have links to the IDM website, and it's got some great resources, and there were those YouTube clips of Jason Fung that I was also referring to. By the way, go onto my website and have a look at some great new resources. We've got ebooks, we've got webinars, and an online course. So, until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.